Candace. Do a wonderful job here with the Tread of Pioneers Museum. I think we ought to give Candace and her battalion of helpers a hand as well, because she's done great things. You might remember, if you were here last March, I did a talk about the 10th Mountain Division. Did any of you sit in on that? Okay, and in spite of that, you came back. I'm really amazed. My dad had served in that division, and that was what really got me interested in military history. And the book that I wrote about the 10th, called Soldiers on Skis, was the first book that I had written. And I've got 15 books out now, soon to be 16, coming up in a few months. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm originally from the Chicago area. I was in the Army for 5 years, West Germany for about 2.5, Vietnam for a year, and then another year at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, which is how I got to Colorado. I lead battlefield tours for the Smithsonian in Europe, usually D-Day tours. I've lately picked up a gig lecturing on Viking cruises, not a bad job if you can get it. And I'm on the board of directors at the Broomfield Veterans Museum in one of the Denver suburbs. And last year, I don't know how this happened, but I got inducted into the Colorado Authors Hall of Fame. I think they mixed me up with the other Flint Whitlock, but I'm keeping the trophy, I'm not giving it back. Tonight I'm going to take you back about 160 years and talk about Colorado's role in the Civil War. I'm mostly a World War II historian, but I was very fascinated by all the stories I heard about Colorado in the Civil War, and a lot of people I've talked to don't even realize that Colorado was in the Civil War. So I worked on this book called Distant Bugles, Distant Drums. There's some copies of it in back. They make wonderful Christmas presents, Gesundheit. And hopefully some of you will consider buying it. I'll show you this later. But the title of my slide, my presentation, is How Colorado in the Civil War. But it's really, my real title is How Colorado Won the Civil War for the Union. And that might seem like a preposterous boast, tongue-in-cheek by a Coloradan, one not shared by too many other historians. But by the time I'm finished, I hope that you'll concede that I've made my point, as outlandish as it might seem right now. The effort by the Confederacy to conquer the American West was the smallest campaign in terms of the number of participants, but the largest in terms of the amount of distance covered and the nature of the South's goals and the North's ultimate achievements. It's also one of the least known campaigns of the Civil War. When I first started this project about 1995, I found several books about the New Mexico campaign written from a Southern perspective, but there was very little from the Northern viewpoint. As a Colorado resident since 1970, I decided to do something about that. During my 10 years of research and writing, I uncovered a treasure trove of material in the Colorado Historical Society's research library in the form of microfilm copies of newspapers of that era. The papers were filled with editorials, articles, letters to the editor, and first-hand accounts by the participants in the events. Also, there were several diaries and files of correspondence and manuscripts and photos of men who had actually been there and done that. Primary source material that had been little used or perhaps unknown by previous authors. Since there were no Civil War veterans still around for me to interview, it was the next best thing. That the Confederates' attempt to invade Colorado and take over our state's mineral riches was stopped, and the rebels forced to retreat back from whence they had come, was due in large part to these men, a group of courageous and contentious men from Colorado. What my research turned up was that there was a huge amount of dissension in the ranks and anger at the commander of the Colorado Regiment, anger that verged on mutiny. We'll get to that in more detail in a few minutes. Let's go back to that time just prior to the start of the Civil War. As you can see, the western United States from 1855 to 1860 looked considerably different than it does today. For example, there was no Colorado. Colorado was carved out of parts of the Kansas Territory and the Utah Territory. The New Mexico Territory was one big blob here. There was not Arizona as we know it to be in that same place today. Colorado was nearly 2,000 miles away from where the major battles of the war, involving tens of thousands of soldiers, would take place, compared to Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, and just about every other battle you can name. The battles here in the far west might seem like little more than small, insignificant skirmishes. Yet the stakes and the mineral resources in Colorado were of immense importance to both sides. Let's start with a little backstory. The Colorado gold boom in 1858 brought men seeking to strike it rich from everywhere, from the East Coast and the Midwest, from the South, from California, where the gold boom of 1849 had gone bust, even from Europe. The cry of Pikes Peak or bust was heard throughout the land as thousands of hardy pioneers bent on seeking their fortune headed to Colorado, or as it was briefly known then, the Jefferson Territory. Many of the early immigrants here to the Yampa Valley also came because of the lure of gold. It was a long and perilous journey across the vast barren plains, for the railroad lines ended at Independence, Missouri. Anyone wanting to go farther west did so by wagon or stagecoach, a long, bumpy ride. The biggest town in the Rockies at that time was called Denver City, a wild, wide-open frontier town. In 1861, its population was about 2,000, but Denver City was the supply base that enabled the mines to the west to stay in business. Gold then sold for $18 an ounce, and it's about $1,800 an ounce today. Men who struck an untapped vein became rich beyond their wildest dreams. As I said, miners came from all over, Britain, Germany, America's eastern states, and especially from the South. As you might imagine, with all the pro-secessionists flooding into the area, trouble was brewing, and fights and riots in the streets of Denver City were quite common. In nearby Kansas, of which the Colorado Territory was once a part, a mini civil war erupted between pro and anti-slavery advocates. In fact, Bleeding Kansas, as it was called, even had two state capitals, one pro-slavery and the other anti-slavery, between 1854 and 1859. A number of events provided the fuel that eventually ignited into the conflagration known as the American Civil War. For the sake of brevity, I'll skip over such preceding factors like the Wilmot Proviso, the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision. I'll just say that, oops, jumping ahead here. There we go. I'll just say that as the nation expanded westward in a drive that President James Polk called Manifest Destiny, the issue of whether or not slavery should be allowed in the new territories began to strain the fabric of the nation. Abraham Lincoln was an outspoken opponent of slavery, and when he was elected president and inaugurated in 1861, the nation split in two. Lincoln knew the importance of gold and silver, for the nation's financial system was built on the gold standard. How was the new president to keep the West and all its mineral riches from sliding into the Confederacy's camp? He needed a strong pro-union man to govern the new Colorado Territory that had been carved out of the western half of the Kansas Territory, a territory initially called Jefferson, but which in February 1961 changed its name to Colorado. One of the several candidates for governor, including one of Denver's founders, General William Larimer, shown here, the man that Lincoln selected was William Gilpin. Why Gilpin, and who was he? William Gilpin, as his biographer noted, was a true Renaissance man and one of the most remarkable men of his day. In fact, one historian said, "One day the West will realize it owes more to Billy Gilpin than to any other man." High praise indeed. But what do we know about Gilpin? Sadly, we know very little today. There's a county in Colorado and a street in Denver and a mountain near Telluride named after him. But that's about it. There are only 2 or 3 known photos of him, and this is one. So let's find out who this remarkable man was. Gilpin was born in 1815 to a prominent Pennsylvania family. He was schooled in England, then entered the University of Pennsylvania in 1830. I don't think Hans knew him personally. He's not that old. He went to Penn at the age of 15. He was also a Quaker who was fascinated by war. After graduating from Penn, Gilpin won an appointment to West Point, but dropped out after 2 years, saying the curriculum was too dull. He wanted excitement and the chance for glory. He asked family friend President Andrew Jackson to grant him an officer's commission so he could take part in the Second Seminole War in Florida. Jackson did that, making him a second lieutenant in an elite unit, the 2nd Regiment of Dragoons. But instead of assigning him to Florida, the Army sent him to St. Louis, Missouri, to recruit men from the western frontier. Although Lieutenant Gilpin was unsuccessful as a recruiter, he became intrigued by the promise of the wild, unexplored lands beyond the sunset, and vowed to someday return and explore the area more fully. Gilpin was finally reassigned to Florida, but his unit was detailed to guard captured Indians and runaway slaves, not the glamorous combat duty he had hoped for. Bored with the duty, he resigned his commission and moved back to Missouri. And at 24, became editor of a prominent St. Louis newspaper. But he soon grew bored with that job and moved to Independence, where he decided to become a lawyer. I guess you could do that back in the 1840s. He decided he wanted to be a doctor. You could probably do that too. While living here on the western edge of white civilization in 1843, he used his connections with the powerful Senator Thomas Hart Benton to obtain an invitation to join a surveying expedition to Oregon in 1843, led by Lieutenant John Fremont, one of the leading explorers of the day. It was on this second Fremont expedition that Gilpin fell in love with the West, its potential and its promise. He called the West a pastoral garden. When he returned 2 years later to Washington, D.C. with the Oregonians' petition for statehood in his pocket, Gilpin became a celebrated figure in the nation's capital. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to hear about his travels across the West and about his extraordinary vision for, of all things, a transcontinental railroad, considered as far-fetched as going to the moon. Gilpin was a sensation, and his speeches and published articles about the geography, geology, flora, and fauna of the regions that he and Fremont had explored caused the nation to come down with a strong case of what was termed Oregon fever. This fever was broken only by the outbreak in 1846 of the Mexican-American War. Heading back to Missouri from the nation's capital, Gilpin enlisted as a private in an expeditionary force being formed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, quickly rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, marched to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and successfully commanded a battalion in 2 major battles, the Battle of El Bracito and the Battle of Sacramento, Mexico. Once the year-long campaign was completed, Gilpin, who at this point had contracted malaria, went home to his lonely cabin in Independence. After he recovered and returned to civilian life, Gilpin got back into the newspaper business for a while, but he seemed more interested in land development, starting a town called Westport Landing that would later evolve into Kansas City, Missouri. But he remained restless. He felt that Missouri was much too pro-slavery for his liking. And when Abraham Lincoln ran for the presidency, Gilpin proudly proclaimed that he was the only man in his county who had voted for Lincoln. Out of the blue came an offer to be one of Lincoln's bodyguards, on the rail journey from Springfield, Illinois to the inauguration in Washington. Gilpin jumped at the chance. As the nation split apart, on the recommendation of William Larimer and other trusted advisors, Lincoln appointed Gilpin governor of the newly formed Colorado Territory. It was essential that Colorado be protected from any attempts by the South to take it over. Colorado represented the federal government with a conundrum. It was too far away to be of much value in providing troops for the Union in the war, but too rich in gold and silver to be ignored. The budget for establishing and running the new territory, however, was almost non-existent. Realizing that he would need money, and lots of it, in order to raise and equip a military force in the event the territory was threatened with an invasion, Gilpin went one night to the White House to ask Lincoln and Secretary of War Simon Cameron what he should do. Cameron said, "We have not a cent to spare." And Lincoln told him, "But raise a force and send us the bills, and we will see that they are paid." Gilpin took Lincoln at his word, but got nothing in writing, a fact that would soon come back to haunt him. Meanwhile, while Gilpin and Lewis Ledyard Weld, his young territorial secretary, the equivalent today of lieutenant governor, were receiving their final instructions on how to run a territory, back in New Mexico at a decrepit, lonely outpost near Taos called Cantonment Burgwin, Louisiana-born Major Henry Hopkins Sibley, serving in New Mexico, was writing to the War Department and offering his resignation so that he might realize his dream to join the Confederacy, receive a promotion, and lead a Confederate army from Texas into the Southwest, driving all the way and seizing a much-needed port in California. And then he wanted to also invade Colorado to capture the gold and silver mines. It was a grand dream, and Sibley was probably the least likely person to be entrusted with leading such an operation. Possessed of an explosive temper, a disdain for detail, and a strong affinity for alcohol, in an army not known for temperance, behind his back he was called the walking whiskey keg. Besides being a rather flamboyant drunkard, Sibley had served in the same dragoon unit that William Gilpin had in Florida and had performed heroically in the Mexican War. And he did have an inventive mind. The famous Sibley tent, shown here, was his design, and was in widespread use throughout the Army for many decades. He also invented the Sibley stove, which was used up until World War II. But his most dramatic invention was his scheme to take over the Southwest for the Confederacy. Sibley met with Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, and presented his plan to capture the Western United States. Incredibly, Davis bought it. Even more incredibly, Davis promoted Sibley to Brigadier General and authorized him to raise a 3,500-man brigade in Texas to lead the campaign. Sibley headed off to San Antonio, Texas to recruit, equip, and train his unit, while his former commanding officer in New Mexico, Colonel Edward Canby, was trying to figure out what to do in the case of a Southern invasion. His command had just experienced a wholesale defection of officers like Sibley to the Southern cause. The federal government was ordering him to transfer his best troops to the east. The Indians were on the warpath, and all he had left to defend the New Mexico territory, besides a few battalions of regulars, were the local Hispanic militias, whom Canby regarded as less than worthless. He was sure an invasion was coming and wondered if he could possibly stop it. Canby and Sibley were well acquainted. They had both fought with distinction during the Mexican War, but Canby was everything that Sibley was not. Calm, quiet, methodical, prudent, dependable, and a teetotaler. Canby and Sibley had both attended West Point at the same time, served during the grueling march to put down the Mormon uprising in Utah in 1857 and 58. And Canby had served on Sibley's court-martial when the latter was charged with dereliction of duty. And he was Sibley's commanding officer in New Mexico, where they conducted a long campaign together against hostile Indians. Meanwhile, while Sibley had been in Richmond presenting his scheme to Jeff Davis, William Gilpin was arriving in Denver City by stagecoach on May 27, 1861. Well, once Canby learned that Gilpin had taken office, he wasted no time in writing to him and requesting that Gilpin send to New Mexico all the troops that he had at his disposal. But Gilpin had none. Gilpin realized Canby was close to desperate, and so he authorized this man, John Potts Sloe, a very forceful individual and a lawyer from Ohio, who had made an impressive speech during Gilpin's welcoming reception in Denver City, to begin recruiting a militia force. Then Gilpin authorized another lawyer, Samuel Tappan, to help Sloe with his recruiting efforts. The goal was to create a regiment of 1,000 men. Ads like these were placed in the local newspapers. A regiment consisted of 10 companies, each with 100 men. A number of the company commanders, shown here, were prominent individuals within Colorado, but few of them had any military training. For example, Ned Wincoop, who would command Company A, was a local sheriff and an actor in Denver. Scott J. Anthony, commander of Company E, was the cousin of the famed suffragette Susan B. Anthony. Samuel Cook, commander of the Mounted Infantry Company, would serve several terms as Denver mayor in the years after the war. There was one Mounted Infantry Company. The rest of the men were on foot. As the unit grew, Gilpin promoted Sloe to colonel and put him in command of the regiment. What Gilpin apparently did not know was Sloe's background. Sloe had been quite outspoken and belligerent in his native Ohio. He had been run out of office after beating up a fellow lawmaker in the Ohio legislature before coming west to open a law office. A less popular choice for commander is hard to imagine. For his abrasive manner and hypercritical, Martinet's personality eventually antagonized almost every officer and enlisted man under his command. Today we'd call it a toxic workplace environment. Samuel Tappan was promoted to lieutenant colonel, second in command of the regiment, while this man, a Methodist minister named John Milton Shivington, was made a major. Gilpin had initially appointed the 6'7", 250-pound Shivington to be the regimental chaplain, but Shivington turned it down, saying he wanted a fighting command. With winter coming on and the mines shutting down, more and more miners signed up to serve and make $11 a month as a private, which is about $400 in today's money. 10 companies eventually were formed from across the territory, and the 1,000-man unit was named the 1st Regiment of Colorado Volunteers, often referred to as Gilpin's Pet Lambs. The soldiers were housed in downtown Denver hotels, close to the saloons, the gambling dens, and the prostitutes' so-called cribs. Not a good situation. A site for a permanent camp was needed. Camp Weld, named for the territorial secretary, was built by the troops themselves 2 miles south of downtown on the banks of the South Platte River. There's a map showing the camp's location. But Gilpin needed the money to buy the equipment and all of the other items that his unit needed. He had none, and the federal government had given him none. And he came up with a brilliant, if illegal, solution, what he called site drafts. Essentially, they were unauthorized IOUs on the federal treasury. As his need for more equipment grew, Gilpin kept the printing presses running and churning out site drafts. If the regiment needed a wagon costing, say, $500, the territory's purchasing agent gave the wagon's owner a site draft supposedly worth $500. Everyone was promised that if they would accept the site drafts, the government would pay them. Gilpin crossed his fingers and hoped that that would be the case. After all, Lincoln had told him to send the bills to Washington and they'd be paid. Honest Abe wouldn't lie, would he? Eventually, Gilpin doled out site drafts amounting to $375,000, equivalent of $40 million in today's money. Training at Camp Weld went on, but the officers and men became bored and restless, eager to see action. The war was not going well for the Union at this point. In 1861, Fort Sumter had fallen, followed by defeats at the First Battle of Bull Run, and then Big Bethel, Carthage, and Wilson's Creek in Missouri, and so on. And everyone was accusing Gilpin and Sloe of avoiding committing the regiment to battle. One of the company commanders, Jacob Downing, carried on open warfare with his commander, John Sloe, accusing him of cowardice in a barrage of letters to the editor of a Denver newspaper. Sloe also jailed a company commander whose troops mutinied. And as idle men will do, the soldiers found themselves getting drunk and getting into trouble. One company commander even revolted against, one company even revolted against its company commander, Samuel Logan, complaining that he was too harsh with them. Another company deserted and left Denver in hopes of finding some Confederates to fight. They were quickly hauled back to town. If the troops were eager for battle, they would just need to sit tight and wait for the right moment. Well, the right moment was coming. Under continuing pressure from Canby in New Mexico, Gilpin sent the only soldiers he had, 2 companies of Colorado militia from Canyon City. This map shows the location of various forts in the Southwest. We've got here in the Colorado Territory, Fort Garland, Fort Wise on the Santa Fe Trail. Here's Santa Fe, here's Fort Union. We'll talk about that more. Down here is Fort Craig on the border of Arizona and New Mexico. You can see here how the 2 territories were now laterally side by side. One Colorado militia company that Gilpin sent was under Captain James H. Ford, shown here in a later photo, while the other was commanded by Theodore H. Dodd. The 2 companies marched over 400 miles south from Canyon City to Fort Craig in southern New Mexico, and just in time. General Sibley and his troops were on the march. After leaving San Antonio over here, they continued up to El Paso, Texas, and Fort Bliss, knocking off various Union forts and outposts along the way, trying to pick up supplies as they went. After reaching Fort Bliss at El Paso, Sibley discovered that the food and other supplies he thought would be waiting for him had been destroyed by the fleeing Union troops. Sibley had no choice but to keep continuing north along the Rio Grande in hopes that his men and horses could somehow forage off the parched and arid land or steal food from the locals. For someone who had boasted to Jeff Davis that he was intimately acquainted with New Mexico, Sibley was leaving a lot to chance. By the time Sibley got to Fort Craig, the major army post in the southwest, 150 miles south of Santa Fe, Colonel Canby and about 3,000 men, about the same number that Sibley had, were ready and waiting for them. This map shows the location of Fort Craig. The battle, which took place on February 21, 1862, didn't unfold as anyone had expected. After an initial skirmish, Colonel Canby refused to be drawn out of the fort to do battle with the Texans. It was only after Sibley's men had bypassed Fort Craig that Canby chose to do battle at a place on the Rio Grande, north of the fort, near a terrain feature known as Mesa del Contadero. The Union troops marched out of Fort Craig to engage the Texans across the Rio Grande. Here's a map showing the disposition of troops at the height of the battle. One of the Union regiments involved in the battle was made up of well-trained Hispanic troops commanded by Colonel Kit Carson. Yes, that Kit Carson. The rebels charged the Union guns with lances, forcing Canby's men, including Captain Dodd's men from Canyon City, to flee across the river and, defeated and dejected, head back to Fort Craig to lick their wounds. You probably are surprised to see that they had color film during the Civil War. But many of the photos I'll be showing are of Civil War reenactments, because there were just so few photographers in the West that I had to fill it with some other images here. But Sibley, the walking whiskey keg, missed the battle because he was drunk in his wagon, but his able subordinates carried on and delivered a decisive victory for the South. Now there was nothing to stop Sibley's advance northward to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, the largest depot in the Southwest called Fort Union in Colorado. Back at Fort Craig, Canby sent off by messenger an urgent request to Governor Gilpin to send whatever men Colorado might have at this point to stem the rebels' northward advance. An invasion of Colorado now seemed certain. But Gilpin was no longer in Colorado. He was in Washington, D.C. As Ricky Ricardo might have said, Gilpin had a lot of splaining to do to Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, why Colorado businessmen had sent $375,000 worth of sight traps to him with demand that they be paid for the equipment they had supplied to Gilpin's pet lambs. So Gilpin was then relieved of his duties as territorial governor and was replaced by this man, Dr. John Evans, a friend of Lincoln's from Illinois. By the way, Evans founded the town of Evanston, Illinois, and Northwestern University, where incidentally my grandson is now attending. I don't know if he knows this story about Evans. Left in Denver City to govern the territory in Gilpin's absence was the Territorial Secretary, Lewis Ledyard Wild. Well, when he received Canby's request for troops, Wild ordered Colonel Sloe to prepare the regiment to march south to New Mexico and keep the Texans out of Colorado. But the revolt against Sloe was growing. After accusing Sloe of cowardice, the colonel had Captain Downing confined to his barracks until it came time to march. The regiment was assembled at Camp Weld and given a fond farewell by the citizens of Denver City on February 22nd, 1862. After marching a few miles out of town, the regiment was hit by a fierce blizzard, causing the march to be halted until the weather cleared the next day. At last the march resumed in earnest. 400 miles lay ahead, and many of the soldiers wondered if they would reach New Mexico in time to stop the Texans. But resentment and anger against Colonel Sloe was festering, along with the blisters on the men's feet. At one point, a near mutiny broke out when members of one of the companies, made up entirely of German miners, refused to fall in. They threatened to shoot Sloe because they had received only 2 wagons for their equipment, while the other companies all had 3. Cooler heads soon prevailed, but it would not be the last time someone threatened or tried to kill their commander. The brutal march continued. One of the men wrote, "We have made today the greatest march on record, have marched 42 miles on foot without water for 26 miles of that distance." Farther to the south, Sibley's brigade was still coming up the Rio Grande Valley. They reached Albuquerque, where a large Union Army supply depot stood. The Texans were still in desperate need of food and forage. But as Sibley's men approached, they saw the depot go up in flames, destroyed by the Union troops before they abandoned Albuquerque. The Texans had no choice but to begin to kill and eat their animals. In 18 days, Sloe's men had covered over 300 miles from Denver City to Fort Union, the North's major supply base in the Southwest. At last, on the night of March 10th, 1862, the 1st Regiment of Colorado Volunteers marched into the fort to the cheers of the small garrison at the post. Meanwhile, Sibley's advance elements had reached Santa Fe, where they relaxed, then went on a pillaging spree, helping themselves to all the food and drink they could find. Instead of hurrying on to Fort Union, the Texans bided their time, evidently waiting for Sibley and the rest of the brigade to arrive from Albuquerque. The delay, as events would soon prove, would cost the rebels their chance at victory. Fort Union was commanded by this man, Colonel Gabriel Paul, a 20-year Army veteran. He had received a message from Canby, still down at Fort Craig, telling him to keep the Colorado Regiment at Fort Union and await further orders. But Sloe was having none of it. His attitude was, "We marched all this way to fight the rebels, and that's what we're going to do." And so 12 days after arriving at Fort Union, Sloe and Gilpin's pet lambs, along with James Ford's company from Cañon City and several companies of regular infantry, cavalry, and our batteries of artillery, marched out of Fort Union and towards Santa Fe, 90 miles away. While resting in Santa Fe, a regiment of Texas troops under the command of this man, Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry, had learned that Sloe and the Coloradans had arrived at Fort Union and set out eastward along the Santa Fe Trail to meet them. The meeting would come at a deep cut in the earth known as Glorietta Pass at Apache Canyon. The advanced Union elements under the command of Major John Shivington were headed westward on the same trail. They were on a collision course with the Texans, led by Major Charles Pyron. The first clash occurred here on March 26, 1862, about 4 miles west of a stage stop known as Pigeons Ranch. Here are some views of Pigeons Ranch about 20 miles east of Santa Fe. As you can see, it was right on the Santa Fe Trail. There was a saloon, a water well, a blacksmith shop, a small hotel with restaurant, and a corral for the draft animals. Another view of the place. Because of its location in a narrow part of the canyon, it made for a perfect defensive position. That rock cropping in the upper right-hand corner would get a name, Sharpshooters Ridge, in the coming battle. As I mentioned, Shivington's men ran into Scurry's forces about 4 miles west of Pigeons Ranch. This is an artist's rendering of the charge of Captain Cook's mounted company during this first clash. The attack sent the outnumbered rebels reeling backward, and Shivington's men pressed on. About a half hour later, the two sides met again, and once again, the Unionists were victorious. The rebels fled across this small wooden bridge that spanned an arroyo. Then they tore up the bridge behind them. Undeterred, Captain Cook's men were in hot pursuit. Their horses jumped the 16-foot gap and continued on after the Texans. 2 more clashes took place that afternoon, and the rebels took up defensive positions at Johnson's Ranch at the western end of Apache Canyon. With darkness closing in, Shivington and his men headed back 10 miles to Koslowskis Ranch at Pecos, New Mexico. This is Mr. Koslowski here. This is where Sloe and the rest of the command were camped. The troops were excited about the prospect of resuming the battle under a flag, resuming the battle the next day. But the Texans had sent a couple of men under a flag of truce to ask for a day to collect their dead and wounded, and Sloe agreed to that. March 27th was a day for both sides to tend to their casualties and bury their dead, and to wonder about what was to come. That night around the campfires at Koslowskis Ranch, the Union officers planned their strategy for the next day. It was decided that Shivington, who had performed well in his first day of combat, would take about 500 men and climb up and over Glorietta Mesa and come down on the west side, where it overlooked Johnson's Ranch, and attack the Confederates from the rear. Meanwhile, Sloe would take the rest of the command, almost 900 men, and meet Scurry's Texans, who by then numbered about 600, head on in Glorietta Pass. The next day, March 28th, Shivington's command broke off from Sloe's main body and climbed the steep slopes of Glorietta Mesa and traveled across the top. Here you can see the Santa Fe Trail. There's Pigeons Ranch. Sloe's command is going this way. Scurry and Pyron are meeting them right after the bend in the road here. And Shivington is coming across the mesa to attack the rear of the Confederate lines at Johnson's Ranch. This is a shot of Glorietta Mesa from the eastern side, the side that Shivington and his men climbed. It was a very daunting piece of real estate. It wasn't long before Sloe's men met Scurry, who had received reinforcements during the night. In the broad fields just west of Pigeons Ranch, the two sides fought even more violently than they had just 2 days before. Both sides were now well equipped with artillery and began blasting away at each other from close range. I brought with me a piece of a cannonball. Got this out of the archive at the Broomfield Veterans Museum. I will leave it up here in front, and after the talk tonight, you can come up, and probably weighs about 5 pounds. It's pretty nasty. Obviously, it's a part of a larger shell. I was going to have you pass it around, but I'm afraid somebody might drop it on their foot. And Tread of Pioneers insurance policy doesn't cover cannonball accidents. But you can imagine what it was like to be on the receiving end of an artillery discharge such as this. Gradually, the Texans began to push back Sloe's men towards Pigeons. The battle went on for hours. The company of German miners who had earlier threatened to kill Sloe because of the wagon flap was sent by Sloe into an arroyo to outflank the rebels, but they were spotted and shot to pieces. After the survivors, furious at Sloe, retreated from this hot spot. They then turned their weapons on Sloe, trying to kill him. He spent much of the rest of the battle hiding behind a tree, trying to keep from being shot by his own men. The Battle of Pigeons Ranch continued to rage. For 3, 4, 5 hours it went on, the Texans gradually pushing the Union troops back towards Pigeons. The Texans also tried taking the high ground on either side of the ranch, but were held off, and a number of rebel officers were killed. But what was happening with Chivington? While the Battle of Pigeons Ranch went on, Chivington and his men had reached the western edge of Glorietta Mesa and looked down on to behold the rebel encampment at Johnson's Ranch, full of supply wagons, mules, and only a handful of guards. Realizing this golden opportunity before him, Chivington sent his troops running and sliding down the mesa. Again, this is a view of the mesa from Johnson's Ranch. Chivington's men burned the wagons, killed the mules, and took the guards prisoner. Here you see the Texans fleeing. You see Chivington's men reclimbing the Glorietta Mesa and the supply wagons on fire. As they crossed the route that they had come over the mesa, they were unaware of the battle that had been taking place down in the canyon below them. The fight for Pigeons Ranch continued unabated. As darkness fell and the smoke of discharged weapons filled the battlefield, and with their ammunition running low, Sloe's Union troops made a strategic withdrawal back to Koslowskis Ranch. As Scurry's Texans reached Pigeons Ranch and claimed victory, a rider came up and informed Scurry that Chivington's men had circled around behind Confederate lines, destroyed the precious supplies, and killed most of the draft animals. With no supplies and no other reinforcements in the immediate vicinity, Scurry had no other option than to abandon Pigeons Ranch and head back to Santa Fe. John Sloe seldom worried about anything, but he was suddenly worried that Canby would have him court-martialed for disobeying orders by leaving Fort Union and doing battle with the Texans. And he was worried that his own men might succeed in killing him. So as the rebels retreated back to Santa Fe, Sloe marched his men back to Fort Union and then resigned his leadership of the 1st Colorado. It was then Chivington, not the second-in-command Tappan, who was elected by the men to command the 1st Colorado. Out of supplies and hope, the Texans could not continue on. Sloe and Chivington and the rest of the pet lambs and the regular Union soldiers had turned back the would-be invaders and sent them stumbling on a 700-mile death march back to Texas. In addition, a column of Union troops was marching from California, as well as 5,000 men from Fort Leavenworth. They were all heading to New Mexico to finish off Sibley. They didn't arrive in time, and they weren't needed anyway, because Sibley's brigade was finished. Of the 3,500 Texans who entered New Mexico, only about 1,100 returned to Texas. The others were either dead, wounded, sick, prisoners, or deserters. Had General Sibley not been drunk and dawdling in Albuquerque, and had he sent the rest of his brigade into Apache Canyon and Glorietta Pass and captured the desperately needed supplies at Fort Union, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Perhaps the South might have invaded and taken control of Colorado and its mineral riches, helping the South to finance its war and win its ultimate goal, its independence from the North. France and England wanted to help the South, but they were waiting for a major Confederate victory before fully committing themselves to the Southern cause. But those are the great what-ifs of history that will never be known. The fact is, thanks to the courage and determination of the boys from Colorado, Gilpin's pet lambs, the South failed in its reach for empire, and the Union ultimately won the war. Did Colorado win the Civil War for the Union? Well, I think they played a major role in making sure that the Union did win. I hope I've made my case. I've always liked to end my books and talks with an epilogue, what happened to the people and places I've written and talked about. So if you give me 5 more minutes, I'll wrap things up. First, what were the casualties on both sides during Sibley's campaign? According to my chart, during Sibley's entire campaign, you can see that the casualties were remarkably low, especially when compared to the big battles in the east. Next, the places. Camp Weld in Denver burned down in 1865, and no trace remains of it today. But a historical marker has been placed in the southwest corner of the site in a gritty industrial section of Denver. Fort Garland in southern Colorado, where Ford's and Dodge companies stopped briefly on the march down from Canyon City to New Mexico. We really didn't talk much about Fort Garland. Has been restored by the Colorado Historical Society and is a popular tourist attraction. How many people have visited Fort Garland? We have 1, 2, okay, it's a place to see. Fort Craig is a National Historic Site. It's a little hard to find, but only a few crumbling remnants of the buildings remain. There were 3 fort unions that existed near Springer, New Mexico. The one that the Colorado troops reached in 1862 was a star fort, badly eroded but still visible in this aerial photo. The third and final fort union was built after the Civil War and existed until 1891, when it became obsolete and was abandoned by the Army. Today, you can visit the ruins, and they have a nice museum there as well. Koslowskis Ranch still exists. It was later bought by the actress Greer Garson and her husband Buddy Fogelson, a wealthy businessman. Today it's owned by the National Park Service. A few years ago, I took part in an effort to locate bodies buried in fields around the ranch. Through the use of ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, we did locate and mark a number of graves, maybe about 20. But permission has not been granted to exhume those bodies and give the soldiers a proper burial in the National Cemetery at Santa Fe. Here's what Pigeons Ranch looked like around the time of the battle and all that's there today, just a single building. Here's a portion of the battlefield that's now managed by the Pecos National Historical Park, a unit of the National Park Service. I-25 runs right through the battlefield, and about 80% of the battlefield is on private property. And now for the people. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the name John Shivington, but not because he was the hero of the Battle of Glorietta. Following the orders of Governor John Evans, he led a motley group of Indian fighters to attack and wipe out an encampment of peaceable Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians in November of 1864 at a place called Sand Creek on the eastern plains of Colorado. How many of you have heard about this massacre? Okay, vast majority. So the hero of Glorietta became vilified as the butcher of Sand Creek. After resigning as commander of the 1st Regiment of Colorado Volunteers, John Sloe moved to Washington, D.C., was promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to command the military district of Alexandria, Virginia after the war. He returned to the West and became Chief Justice of the New Mexico Territory. But in 1867, his violent temper got him into an argument with a territorial official who shot and killed him in the bar of a Santa Fe hotel. Sloe's second in command, Samuel Tappan, became commandant of Fort Garland in 1862, then traveled back east before returning to Colorado to try and bring peace between the Indians and whites. He died in 1913. Kit Carson stayed in the Army, and in 1863 was forced by his superiors to evict the Navajos from their homes and escort them to a reservation at Bosque Redondo, New Mexico. The Indians refused, and the pro-Indian Carson was ordered to lead a war party against them. In 1865, Carson was promoted to Brigadier General, became commandant of both Fort Garland and Fort Union. He died in 1868 and is buried in Taos, New Mexico. Gabriel Paul, commandant at Fort Union, went on to fight in the east. He was grievously wounded at Gettysburg when a bullet tore through both eyes and blinded him. Edward Canby also remained in the Army, fought in several campaigns in the east, and was promoted to Major General. In the 1870s, he was sent to the Pacific Northwest to make peace with the Indians when he was shot and killed in 1873 by one of the chiefs during peace negotiations. The city of Canby, Oregon is named in his honor. After New Mexico, Henry Hopkins Sibley continued building his reputation as one of the South's worst commanders, going on to fight and lose several more battles. After the war, the U.S. government refused to pay him the $100,000 in royalties he was owed for inventing the Sibley tent. And in 1869, he and a number of former Confederate officers went to Egypt to help build the army there. But he could not control his alcoholism even in a Muslim country, and broke into an English wine merchant's shop and consumed most of the inventory. Financially destitute, he returned to the U.S. and, ravaged by alcoholism, died in Virginia in 1886. In 1863, Lewis Ledyard Weld, the territorial secretary, left Colorado, went east, was commissioned a captain in the U.S. Army, and later commanded a battalion of colored troops in combat, but died of illness in 1865. A Colorado county is named in his honor. And lastly, my favorite, William Gilpin. In a recently published article in a scholarly journal, it was said, quote, "Recent scholarship has demonstrated Gilpin's importance in inspiring a generation of spokesmen for America's manifest destiny. His contribution to Senator Thomas Hart Benton's ideas of Western Empire, his probable influence on Walt Whitman, and the part played by his pastoral garden view of the Great Plains in breaking down the prevailing great American desert image. In addition, it's been pointed out that his insights into the future, particularly his anticipation of the rise of the United States, Russia, and China as world powers, were in many ways more valid than those of much better known American prophets. But chiefly owing to the obscurity into which he fell after his death, Gilpin, for all the attention he has received, has remained a shadowy figure," unquote. After being ousted as governor, Gilpin returned to Colorado, got involved in real estate and railroads, owned a huge parcel of land near Fort Garland, and became wealthy when gold was discovered on the property. He married his longtime love, Julia Pratt Dickinson, and they had a son, but they were divorced in 1887. He died in 1894 after being run over by a horse and buggy in Denver. He was 79 years old. This is a shot of the Gilpin family gravesite in Denver. As a postscript, I want to add that the monument to Colorado's Civil War heroes that stood in front of the state capitol for 111 years was torn down by rioters in June 2020 who were protesting racial injustice, apparently and wrongly, thinking that it was either a monument depicting Chivington or it glorified Chivington's Indian fighters who wiped out the encampment at Sand Creek. So there you have it, a very condensed version of how Colorado won the Civil War for the Union. I've really only scratched the surface in my presentation tonight. You might find that hard to believe. But you'll learn much more about the story if you get a copy of the book sold in the back there. Yours for only $28.13, I'm told. It makes a great Christmas gift for the history buff in your family. At this point, I'll open it up to questions in case any of you, if I didn't cover anything completely enough, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you might have. I see.
How many people were in Company A and Company B from Colorado?
I'm sorry, would you do that again?
How many men were in Company A and Company B that went to New Mexico?
How many of them came back from the battle?
How many
Served in those companies?
Pardon me?
How many served in those companies?
Yes.
There were 100 in each.
100
Mm-hmm.
for 200 people.
Right. And so it was, as I showed on that one chart of the casualties, those who were killed or wounded were relatively few compared to some of the other battles that the two sides engaged in throughout the rest of the Civil War. One of the nice things about the size of this battle and the size of the forces was I'm able to focus in on individual soldiers and tell their stories and to create almost an interview of who they were based on their diaries, their letters, and things that other authors wrote about them. And I think you get to know some of the people. I found photographs that I sprinkled in the book of these people that have not appeared in any other publication. So it's an interesting way to get into the minds of the participants. Yes, Mary?
Did President Lincoln communicate with the commanders? He was communicating in other parts of the country with commanders. Was he paying attention to the West and writing letters, or is there any indication of Lincoln?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was President Lincoln aware of what was going on out here in the West? Was he writing letters about it? How involved was he? I think once he had appointed Gilpin to be the territorial governor, he pretty much had other things on his mind, and he just let the pet lambs do their thing and hopefully come out on top. Other questions in the back?
Did the companies after the Civil War, did they just fall into like the Indian War campaigns, or what did they do? They just end up under Indians?
Okay, the question was what happened after the Battle of Glorietta? Did the Union soldiers go on to fight other battles? Did they participate in the Indian Wars? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. There was another unit that was formed. It's called the first Colorado regiment was put on horseback. They discovered that because of the vast distances in the West that it was impractical to have troops marching everywhere. And so they became the first Colorado Cavalry Regiment. Then there was the second Colorado Cavalry Regiment. Both of these units, they took part in actions in Colorado, but they also went to fight in places such as Kansas and Missouri. Chivington, at the direction of Governor Evans, formed a third Colorado regiment. It was not a military trained type of unit. They were mostly just, I guess, ne'er-do-wells. They served for 100 days enlistment. They got paid for killing Indians and forever disgraced the name of the U.S. Army in the West, even though they were not considered regular troops. Hans?
Do I recall correctly that early in the Civil War, it was considered a Confederate sentiment in Denver?
Yes.
And that they had to use force basically to put that down before they could do all the rest of this?
Yeah, the question was how extensive was the Confederate influence in Denver City prior to the outbreak of the war and then right after it. And it was considerable. I saw some figures that said maybe 40% of the people in Denver City were pro-Southern. And there's one story told that there was a general store in downtown Denver that some of the Southern sympathizers raised a rebel flag above the building, and angry citizens immediately tore it down and beat up the Confederate sympathizers who had put it up. But there were quite a few disturbances on the streets of Denver City related to this schism between pro and South factions in the territory. Yeah. Yes.
So is most of your research, like when you go digging around, like you said microfilm and microfiche, is like what percentage of your book is from that versus we all Wikipedia everything, right? I mean, you can't count on that being honest.
Yes, right. Well, the question was how much of my research was a result of looking at microfiche and microfilm, these old newspapers from the 1860s. I would say, I don't know if I can give you a percentage, but quite a bit. And it's really a wonderful exercise to go through newspapers of 150 or more years ago and see what people were thinking. First of all, they were really good writers. Most of them were very, very educated and erudite and could write a sentence, you know, that makes your teeth fall out. But it's very instructive to look at the news reports. A lot of the battle reports were from men who were there, and they wrote things down, and then a horseman took what they had written back to Denver. It might have taken 2 weeks to get back there, but you know, here's an account of the Battle of Glorietta Pass. And there were letters to the editor. I talked about Jacob Downing's accusing Colonel Sloe of cowardice, and you can see it right there in the newspaper.
Must have been so exciting when you found that.
Oh yeah,
my
it was so
God.
exciting, you know, to uncover this little, you know, nugget of history that had basically gone unexplored. I found at least one, maybe two diaries in History Colorado's collection that had never been utilized before, and so you get, you know, this day-to-day sense of what the troops.
Is that the only museum you were at? Is History Colorado? Did you go to any libraries, or was everything there?
Well, most of these historical documents are at History Colorado. I did find a few microfilm documents at the State Archives and also at the Denver Public Library. And then, you know, I kind of looked around elsewhere to see, you know, who else might have an archive that I could utilize. But those are my primary sources that I went to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, you guys have been a great audience tonight, and maybe thank you. I think it's most propitious that here we are on December 7th, and instead of talking about Pearl Harbor and the 81st anniversary of that, we're talking about the Civil War. But maybe Candace will invite me back some other December 7th to talk about Pearl Harbor or some other topic. Thank you again so much.